So last night I'm watching the tail end of the Seahawks game. A friend of mine texted me this week, said, "Hey, do you want to go to the GU game? I have tickets." And I was like, "Of course I do." And then he texted and he said, "But it's during the Seahawks game." And I was like, "Of course I want to go hang out with you." I'm like, "Oh, what do I do?" So I went to the game last night and then got home, turned on the Seahawks game. And I got to just confess something. And most of you know, if you're here any longer than last year's Super Bowl, you know that I'm a Broncos fan and then I'm a Seahawks fan, and the two are very close. So I'm a big Seahawks fan, but I'm also a Cam Newton fan. And mainly because in fantasy football, Cam Newton was my quarterback this year. And we had a really rough year in fantasy football. He had a bad car accident. He had some injuries. It was kind of tough. So last night, I turned the game on and I'm finding myself just rooting for Cam. I didn't want the Panthers to win. But I was just kind of rooting for him because he's kind of been my guy all year. And even though it doesn't matter now, I was kind of rooting for him. And he's charging down. Those of you that saw the game, he's charging down last part of the game right before everything really swept in Seattle's favor. And he was just connecting pass after pass. And I was like, way to go. I'm just like, man, that's the Cam Newton that you've been in the past, and you're back, and you're not going to win this game. I don't want you to win this game, but it's just good to see you being you. That's kind of how I was feeling about Cam Newton. And then right at the goal line, he throws this interception that gets run back. For many of you saw this. Anyone see this? Yeah, right? Just pick six, classic. And in that moment, they caught his face. And there was this here's Cam Newton, Superman, And he's the look on his face was this pain, this grimace, this what did I just do? I just marched my team down the field. Everything was perfect. And in this final moment right here, I completely lost the game right here. I looked at that face and I realized that face represents, for me, probably for you, so many moments in life when we're clipping along and things are going the way that we want them to go. We feel like, man, I am absolutely being the man or being the woman that I want to be. I'm actually living my life in a way where the rhythms seem right and things are going pretty good and and then all of a sudden there's that moment in which we do something and we think, what was that? How did that happen? We throw some sort of personal interception, right? And we look and we go, wait, this is going to have consequences, and we're not going to the playoffs, and all these things happen to us in our life where suddenly we're moving along, and then boom, there's this moment, and we go, what was what happened that I just threw some sort of life interception in this life that I'm living? It's interesting because when you read the Bible, and it always fascinates me that people associate Christianity with people who are trying to be perfect or people that pretend to be perfect. Because when you read the Bible, you see anything but perfection. Amen? You look at the Old Testament and you start looking at the characters and the stories, and unless you've just never read, if you read just for 10 minutes the stories of the Old Testament, you realize humanity's broken. And if you think that the New Testament's supposed to be the fixed humanity and people don't make stupid mistakes, just read about the disciples, the apostles of the church. Read about them for more than 5 minutes and you realize they do really stupid things. They throw interceptions. They make mistakes. And in fact, the Bible doesn't just paint this picture, but then it also describes this dynamic in humanity and says that we are broken. The Bible talks over and over again about our brokenness, our fallibility. And there's descriptions even in the New Testament where the disciples talk about us being double-minded. Literally thinking things that are in contradiction to each other. We believe certain things and behave a certain way, or we want to behave this way, but instead we behave that way. The Apostle Paul himself, he talks about this in his letter to the Romans. He says that there's things that I don't want to do that I find myself doing. His soul is grimacing as he says, there's things that I don't want to do, and yet I find myself doing them. Then there's things that I want to do, and I don't find myself doing them. There's this contradiction, this broken. Why do I make these sorts of mistakes? Why do I do these things? Last week we started a series talking about the soul. And the reason that we're talking about this is because the soul is the answer to this question. Why do we throw interceptions? Why do we make mistakes that have catastrophic consequences in our life? Why do we go against the things we know? Why is it that something rises up inside of us and we defy the very things we believe at the core of our being? The response, the answer to those questions is found in the soul. It's in us understanding who we are and how we've been made. last week we really just kind of introduced this topic and really this idea of the soul being so broadly neglected in our culture. And last week we did a few things. If you weren't here, you can listen online. There's an awkward moment if you listen or watch online where we all sat in silence and breathed together. I kind of want to go back and watch that to see what that was like, but I don't like awkward moments that much, so. But it was interesting because that played out into this week of me personally. And I want to tell you that so much of this, and I didn't share it as much at the 9 o'clock last week. I did more at the 11 and the 5:30. But so much of what we're talking about is being born out of where I am right now. And realizing that my soul is tired and my soul needs rest. And my soul is stirred up like the water that we talked about last week. So much of this is so much a part of my experience that even this week, I found myself walking through the week and trying to be, as many of you, just attentive as could be to the pace and to the things I was thinking about, to the condition of my soul. I had conversations with a few friends, and we were just discussing, just the way that we just keep the throttle down, and we're talking about trying to pause and breathe and think about who we really are and what this culture is doing around us, and all of it just giving the evidence of how badly you and I need this. I know how badly I need this, and just a few conversations with a few friends, and we need this so badly. And so this week I want to talk a little deeper. I want us to understand a little bit more of how this operating system of the soul really works. Last week I referred to that the soul is what is really running all the various aspects of our life. The soul is what's kind of keeping us moving. It's not our external circumstances that control our life, and it's not our thoughts that control our life, and it's not necessarily our feelings that control our life, but that it's our soul that controls our life. The soul is that aspect of our whole being that keeps all of the parts and all of the pieces integrated and correlated and working together. There's all of these different aspects, and the soul is the one that keeps them all lined up. I was thinking about this week. I drive a car that's, this year is its 24th year on the road. And driving a car, anyone else drive a car that's like close to 25 years old? Anyone? Okay, there's 4 or 5 of us. Because most of those cars are in the junkyard, right? So I drive this car that's a little older, and here's what's interesting about it. The older it gets, the more sensitive it becomes, right? It's like it's just sensitive. She's just, and it's a she. And I do call her Eleanor, if those of you that watch Gone in 60 Seconds, and it's kind of funny, but she's kind of like, I love my car, but she's 25 years old. And there's these parts that all need to be working together, and it seems like the slightest thing can cause it to run in a way that it's not intended to run. Like there can be all these things, and I have all kinds of warning lights, and when someone borrows my car or drives my car, I literally always have to preface it by, there's going to be some lights that come on while you're driving. Just ignore those. I promise it's going to be okay. Because I've been driving this way for a long time with these lights that are flashing in these different places, right? And so I'm always trying to address these little things. But then there are those moments in which I get everything working the way that it's supposed to work. Like my little car, suddenly all the things come together. And my car drives the way it was intended to drive. Like it is the ultimate driving experience. Like my car, I love my car when everything's working the way that it's supposed to work. Everything aligns. When it's not, you can find cars that are very similar to mine on Craigslist for $500, right? Because there are people that drive cars like my car. They have no idea how all the parts work together. I barely do. But then they drive them and they wear them out, and then they sell them for parts on Craigslist, right? All of these pieces come together, and for you and I to operate in a way in which we don't understand the pieces of our life, for us to keep our foot down on the accelerator, to keep plowing through life and never consider how the parts are integrated and how they move together, eventually what happens to you and me is that we just wear out. We end up being spare parts on Craigslist for $500. So I want to talk about how we're made. We're going to look at several scriptures this morning, but I really want to begin by just simply describing how it is that we're made. How are we formed? What are the various components of what it means to be human? And I want to describe this in a way that I think for some of you, you're going to be a little surprised. I think that some of you are going to go, this is not what I expected. And I think also as you see this and it's unexpected, I think you're also going to understand why you sometimes do the things you don't want to do and don't do the things that you want to do, because this explains it. This unpacks this. I want to talk about some concentric circles that really define who we are, starting ultimately with the core. At the core of every single one of us is this thing that's called the will. And there it is. I was going to draw this morning, but then my drawing sometimes is just not good enough. And so, like circles are tough, and words like will I can't spell. So we have the diagram on the back here for you so you can see it. But the innermost circle of us as human beings is the will. The will is our capacity to choose. The will is our ability to say yes to certain things and no to other things. That's what the will is. When the Bible describes God giving humanity dominion over creation, the ability to rule over creation, he distinguishes us from the rest of creation by saying, you have the ability to choose. You can choose yes, you can choose no, you can make decisions. It is our will that distinguishes you and I from everything else, from things and animals. We are distinct because we have the ability to choose. And because of this, we value this. Like, we value this, first of all, in ourselves, right? We value this enough that when somebody starts to violate our will, our ability to make choices for ourselves, there's something deep that happens internally, right? Something that violates something about who you are, right? This week I went and saw Unbroken with my wife and my parents, and we were sitting in the theater and watching an individual. If you haven't seen the movie, you can ask your neighbor, or if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can enter the century that we're in. But this movie, this individual is being imprisoned, and over again, you just see him being stripped of his will, his ability to make choices for himself. And there is something degrading and dehumanizing. There's something life-eroding as you watch this. And what we identify with as an audience and what grates on us so deeply is this thing called the will being stripped from us. The will is what we respect in ourselves. It's what we respect in other people. So the will is central to ourselves, which brings up a really interesting question if you really think about this. If the will is so important, and if the will is so central, then why isn't life, and specifically the soul aspect, the inner life, who we are, why isn't life, generally speaking, easier? If the will is the center, then why is it that I can't simply use my will to experience God? Why can't I just use my will to do the things that I want to do that are good? Why is it that what's going on? If the will is at the center, what's happening that I can't just choose the right things for me? Because that happens, right? The will is central, but the will is also very limited in its ability. This is important to understand how you and I are made. The will is central to who we are, but the will is limited. If you find yourself doing something, not that this ever would happen, but if you find yourself doing something that goes against your better judgment, right? If this ever happens to you, ever, like you eat an extra piece of cake, right? Or you decide to jump off that bridge with the rope in your hand, right? If you find yourself eating just a little bit more at the meal, like if that ever happens to you, if you ever find yourself saying words that just leaked out of your mouth and you think, why in the world did I just say those things? I didn't want to say those things. If things like that ever happen, where you do something that you really didn't want to do, why didn't the will stop you in this? And this is fundamentally one of the deepest questions I think we all ask. We look at ourselves and say, why do I keep doing this, right? How do I change? Like, this is fundamental to who we are. See, the will is very good at making very large, broad scope, wide scope decisions for us. Things like moving, things like where to live, things like what car to buy, things like getting married. The will is very good. That's like the will does a really good job in those areas. But when it comes to the small things, when it comes to the random things, when it comes to the things that happen very quickly, in our life, when it comes to the things that are deeply rooted in our habits, things that are a part of our behavior patterns, the will is incredibly weak to overcome those things. Which means that if you try to improve your soul with willpower, if you think that somehow taking your soul, and we're going to get to that more in a minute, but what we've been talking about, the soul, if you think my soul is hurting, my soul is not at rest, my soul is just all over the place, if you think you're going to fix that with your will, you will just end up exhausted. You're going to be exhausted. Odds are the people around you are going to be exhausted, right? Like if you think you're going to will your way somehow religiously, somehow behaviorally to fix your soul, it'll never happen. Now, why is this? It helps us understand this when we see the next circle. The next aspect of who we are is our mind. The mind. In the ancient world, the mind referred to everything that we thought and everything that we felt. And so when you read the scriptures and the scriptures talk about the mind is referencing our feelings, it's representing our thoughts, it's the thoughts that are running through our head, it's the feelings that we're experiencing, it's all the ways that you and I are conscious of and experience the world around us. So we have this will that chooses, and then we have these feelings that feel, right? We have these emotions that emote. We have these thoughts that enter in because of the stimulus that's in the world around us. Something happens and we have a response, and that response feels a certain way, or we say a certain thing because of whatever's happening around us. That's our mind at work. That's our mind and our feelings in motion around us. Thoughts and feelings, they have the ability, they have the strength, the power to redirect the will. What we think about, what we feel can actually change what we choose, right? That's why your will can say, I probably shouldn't have this massive bowl of ice cream. But then there's something inside of you that just feels like you should, right? And you resist for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then finally, after everyone's gone to bed, you sneak to the freezer and you pull it out. And the mind overcomes the will, right? So when we think of thoughts that are unworthy, when we think of thoughts that are untrue, when you and I entertain desires that are in opposition to what God wants for our life, when our mind and our feelings go in the opposite direction of what God has designed in us to be whole, it erodes our soul. In fact, in Romans chapter 8, Paul said these words. He said, "For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." Your mind can kill you. Your mind can erode your soul. But your mind can also help deliver life and peace. The mind craves peace. And so what we have is the will, which is our ability to choose yes or no. We have the mind, which is processing the stimulus. It's giving us the emotions. It's influencing. And then thirdly, we have the body. We have our bodies. We have our physical makeup. Our body is our little kingdom, if you will. Our body is the little kingdom where our will and our mind get to reign. Like that's where they get to do things, is within our body. I cannot will anyone else to do something, right? I can't think you to do something, but I can use my body to make you do something, right? Right? Our body is where we have influence, right? Like if you have a mind and you have a will, but you have no body, you have nothing, right? Like you can't operate. And so they're all together. We talked about this last week. There's an integration of these. We need our body to be who we are, and our body is where these things play out. Our bodies are filled with all kinds of appetites and all kinds of cravings and all kinds of habits. That's our body. Our body is this flesh, and there are cravings, and there are appetites, and there are habits. Our bodies also have things that we train it to do. Our bodies can just do things without us having to think about them, right? Our bodies can do things that we don't even think about. Like our will and our minds can actually delegate to our body certain things that we don't want to give attention to after a while, right? When was the last time you really thought hard about tying your shoes? Like, oh man, I really need to focus right now. just, okay, one loop, and then the other loop, and then does this one go around this one, or, right? We don't do that anymore, right? Because our mind and our will trained our body to do that for us without having to think about it, right? I really learned about this when I started teaching my daughter to drive this last year. Because we'd be rolling along in the car, and I had all these moments like, do I have to tell you to do this? Do I have to tell you to use the brakes now? I just thought that was automatic. And it was I found myself, in fact, it drove Sherry crazy because I'd be sitting in the passenger seat and I felt like royalty because I was I kind of have a chauffeur now everywhere I go. So every time I got in the car, it was my chance to text and drive without breaking the law. So I'm on the phone, I'm reading stuff. And whenever Sherry was in the back seat, she's like, honey, you're up there to help with this. Because for me, there were just things I got in the car and I was just you'll get it. You're going to learn this stuff, right? And then slowly, the more I spent in the car with my daughter, the more I realized how much I'm on autopilot when I get in the car, right? Little tiny nuances, little things that I had no idea about nearly cost me my life on several occasions, right? Those of you that have trained your kids to drive a car, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It gets crazy in the car with them because our body has been delegated these things that we no longer think about. And so we have appetites and we have desires and we have these things that we just do. Now, our bodies are amazing, but they are not the whole story, are they? Grant mentioned it earlier. I'll mention it again. I'm really glad our bodies are not the whole story because my body's getting older and it's getting harder to lose the weight after the holidays every single year, right? So there's more to this story than just our body. There's more to the story than just our will. There's more to the story than even just our minds and what we think about and our emotions and what we feel. And that's what brings us really to the final circle, and that's our soul. This is the part we just don't understand or talk about enough. Our soul is what integrates all of this together. Our soul is what brings all of this into one unit. Our soul is who we are. Our soul is why when a plane goes down, they say things like there were such and such number of souls aboard. Our souls are what make up all of us. It is the circumference of all of these things. Our soul is all of this together, working together. That is our soul. Does that make sense? You tracking with me? Anybody? Yeah. So the soul, as I mentioned last week, I'll say this week, it's the operating system. It's what's bringing all of this together. The soul is ultimately seeking harmony among all of these things. Who you are, this soul that encompasses all of it, wants all of these things to integrate together and to work in harmony, to be in rhythm, right? Wants the will and the mind and the feelings, the things you think about and the things you feel, wants the decisions that you're making, the yes and the no's, the things that you're doing with your body, the habits, the appetites, the desire. What the soul longs for is for all of those things to be in harmony together. Which explains why we can believe certain things and yet still feel out of sync, right? We can feel certain emotions in a moment in a church service and feel like this is really good, but we can walk out and still know our souls are a wreck. Right? This is why we can make decisions and know that this decision I just made isn't who I am, but I don't like the decision that I just made. So our soul is who we are, and it's working all of these things together. This is why the word integrity is such a deep soul word. When we say that somebody has integrity, what are we saying? We're saying that if you sliced them through and you saw their mind and their body and their will, you would see a correlation between all of them. This would be thick. It would be solid. There would be a line connecting them. The soul is bringing all of these things together. That's what the soul is doing. It connects these pieces. The soul really is doing three primary things. If you're taking notes, these are things you might want to mention or write down. Number one is what I've just said. It's wanting to integrate our will and our body and our minds, all of it coming together into an integral person to make us whole. Secondly, our soul wants us to connect with God. with our Creator. Our soul longs for this. We're going to talk about this in the weeks to come. But thirdly, our soul wants us to connect with the world around us in a particular way, with nature and with others. That's what our soul is doing. Our soul knows when we've connected with another person. Our soul soars when we see the beauty of creation. Our soul is filled with life when we worship and we're touched by the Spirit of God. That's when our souls come to life. Our soul is seeking integration, connection with God, with others. That's who we are. All of this together. And when we are whole, we know it. That is what a whole person looks like. In the Old Testament, the word soul was synonymous with just the idea of person. When you said soul, it just simply meant person. It was all of you. And when a soul was healthy, it meant that all of these things were cooperating together. A whole person. The soul is all of you. The soul integrates your will, your intentions. The soul integrates your mind, your feelings, your conscience. The soul integrates your body, your actions, and what you're doing. And a healthy soul is when all of these things work the way they were created to work. This is why when you hear phrases like this one, they resonate with you. It's not about what you accomplish, but about who you become. Do we know the difference between what we accomplish and what we become? What we become is about who we are, right? And you hear that, and there's something that resonates inside of us because you know I can do things with my body, and I can accomplish things in my physical being, and yet I may not become the person that I wanted to become. That's why we have this other word called regret, right? See, we understand that the soul is more about who we are. It's more about what we're becoming, not what we've accomplished, not what we've done. And when my will is consistently and freely and joyfully aligned with God, when your will is aligned with God, I find rest. And you find rest. When you choose what God wants you to choose, there's something called rest that you experience. And you go, man, this feels good. And we wonder, why don't I always choose this? How many of you ever do that, right? Like you have these moments, like those of you that have been following Jesus for a while, and I'll talk to those of you that are Christians and you've been trying to do this, and I think this is good to say. There are times when you've made great choices, then you still go back and you do what Paul did, and you make choices you never wanted to make, and you think, why in the world? Like, I know how good it is. I know how my soul feels at rest. Like, I hate the feeling of regret. I hate that sense of guilt and shame that comes over. Like, we have these moments, and you go, why don't I do these things, right? But our will knows, doesn't it? Our will knows when we've aligned with God. God's intent is that our will would oversee or direct our minds, that our will would direct our bodies, so that all of this working the way that it's intended to work will be at rest, at peace. My body's obedient to my will. My mind is thinking about and dwelling on those things that I choose for it to dwell on. I can think about life-giving things. I can think about truthful things. I can have healthy desires. That's what happens. And what usually happens is that we lack the willpower to control the mind, and therefore our body goes places that we don't want it to go. Right? You see how this works? Our bodies are collections of appetites and desires, and they veer out of control, and we have habits that drag us down paths that we never wanted to go down. And then the mind has to justify this, right? Like there's this thing that happens where you say, man, I really want this, and I know I shouldn't do this, but I really want this, and you make the decision to want this. And the will eventually just says, okay, go for it, right? Like your body craves, your body wants something. And so your will finally goes, just do it, okay? I give up, I'm tired of fighting with you. And so just go ahead, right? Give in. You know what I'm talking about? And then as soon as that happens, your mind has a crisis. Because your mind doesn't want to be known as an undisciplined person, right? Your mind doesn't want to be known as somebody who made that kind of choice. Your mind knows, man, I don't want to do this. And so what does your mind do? Your mind has to make sense of this, right? So your body craves and your will gives in, and your mind is left in this position where it has to find some way to reason why you're about to do what you're about to do, or why you did what you actually did. We call these things excuses. We come up with reasons why, right? We explain. We say, well, there's just this one, there's just this one piece of cake. There's just this one thing. Or we go deeper into life and we say, well, if anybody knew the story, if people knew what was really going on, if you knew the deeper, the facts, the details, then you would be able to justify with me the things that my will chose to do. Our mind has to make sense and reconcile these things, which is why we have all of these excuses, why there's always a story, why there's always a reason for the reason that our will has given in, right? Because the will and the body create a crisis for a mind that believes things that are different about ourselves and about other people than what we actually act in. Our mind knows that this is about who we're becoming. All of this, when this happens, when the mind is excusing and the will is giving in and the body's given free rein to run, all of this is described in a phraseology that we looked at last week, where Jesus was talking to his disciples in Matthew 16. And it just describes it so well. Listen to this in verse 26. He says, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" Remember, we talked about this being a present tense reality, that Jesus is saying, you and I, when we have these moments where there's complete lack of integrity, disintegration, not integration, when all of these things break down and the will and the mind and the body are all trying to reconcile the madness that's inside of us, it says that we forfeit our souls. Now that sounds, when you spiritualize that and you make it about destination and not about diagnosis, that sounds like this very dramatic, this very pronounced thing where we go, I met the devil at the crossroads and I sold my soul to play blues guitar. Like, that's what we think about when we read that. But what Jesus is saying is you give up your soul, like you forfeit your soul, like who you are. You give it up. The word forfeit actually means in the Greek language that we allow harm to come to it, that there's injury, that there's force, that something comes against, that we're wounded. We forfeit, we lose something in our soul. Jesus says, what good is it if you gain all these things, you fill your desires and you meet your appetites and that your mind wanders and your will is uncontrolled. You can do all of those things. You can even call those things freedom. But if you violate your soul, you forfeit something. You give up something. And don't we know what that feels like? It doesn't feel like we sold our soul to the devil at the crossroads to play blues guitar, does it? It just feels like something's wrong, right? Like I tried to give in to my will, and my will told me to do this, and I did these things, and I ate what I wanted, and I did what I wanted, and I had sex where I wanted, I did all these things that I thought my will wanted to do, and I'm not any happier. In fact, I'm less happy than I was. But my will told me to do it. My mind gave me a reason why I could. My body craved it. And we just feel there's just this empty, there's just this lostness to us. We're just kind of wandering, lost as this fragmented, disintegrated human person walking around. Which is why Jesus looked at us and said, I came to seek and save those that are lost. Those who have lost their souls, those who are wandering, wounded, broken, and fragmented. I've come to bring you back to being whole again. Now, in this life, I want you to experience this thing called wholeness. Our problem is that this world that we live in does not teach us to pay attention to what matters, does it? Like, we don't circulate resumes that talk about our souls. We circulate resumes that talk about our accomplishments. And Jesus tells this story. There's this interesting story that for some of you might be really familiar, but it's a story, or it's a parable that he tells, which means it's not true events. It's just this illustration meant to describe something that speaks to the spiritual realities, the physical realities that we live in every day, to speak to the things of the soul. And he tells this story, and it truly opens up our eyes to how the soul is integrated. How do we experience this integration of the soul? And here's kind of the scene. Jesus is by the sea, and there's this massive crowd of people that have come to listen to him. And this is fairly normal at this season of his ministry. Like, there are just crowds that are pressing on him. And at this particular moment, Jesus presses out into a boat, gets in a boat, pushes off to the shore, and he's facing the crowd. So you can kind of imagine that now there's this massive group of people around this body of water. There's always a hill, there's always something, so it's like a stadium of sorts that Jesus is looking out, and he's in a boat, and he's speaking, and then he begins to tell this story. He's teaching them, he's giving parables, and this is one of the parables that he gives them. It's found in Mark chapter 4, verse 3. And listen to this. He says, "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil, and produced good grain, growing up and increasing, and yielding 30-fold, and 60-fold, and 100-fold. And he said, he who has ears, let him listen." Which essentially he was saying, if you're human, this is for you. Listen to what I'm saying. There was a sower, and there were seeds, and there was soil. Now, there are a couple of constants in this story, and it's really important to know what the constants and what the variables are, because this is what's going to give us the truth. There's two constants. The first constant in this story is the seed. That this is not a story about good seeds and bad seeds. This isn't a story that's about the seed changing. This is a story that is simply talking about a seed that, given half the chance, like this is a story about a seed that, just giving a moment, if you just give this seed an opportunity, this is a seed that will grow. And this seed, this constant, is a picture of God's desire and God's action, what God wants for us and what God is doing for us in order for our souls to be whole. The end picture is life, it's fruitfulness, it's wholeness, right? We know what that looks like. And so the picture is this seed. It is the vision of God. It's God coming into you. It just needs a chance to sprout something. That's a constant. The second constant is the sower. This isn't about good sowers and bad sowers. It's not about good seeds and bad seeds. It's about the seed that God is planting, and it's about the sower. And the sower, you notice, is generous. He's scattering the seed everywhere. Everywhere. Implication being, all you who have ears, let him hear. All you who are hearing, the seed is scattering. The seed is everywhere. The variable in the story is the soil. The variable in our lives is the soil. The soil is where this gets interesting, because the soil is the soul. The soil is the soul, and there are all kinds of soils. The seed is the same, the sower is the same, but it's the soil that's different. The first thing that he talks about is this hardened soil, this dry soil. The seed is scattered, and it's on the dry soil. The Middle East, this was a picture that everybody would have known. Like, you see a picture of the Middle East today, nobody ever thinks, oh, that's lush and tropical, right? You think, I'm thirsty, give me a Gatorade, right? Fierce grape, right? That's the first thought that comes to mind is, I need, you're just thirsty, it's dry. The first picture is this hard, it falls on the path, it falls on this rigid place. The path is where the farmer walked. The path is where the livestock were kept and brought along to where they were going. The path was this dry, concrete of a place. It's hard, it's dry. And souls get that way, don't they? We know people that are open-minded and can talk about ideas, right? And you know people that sometimes can make really great decisions and maybe even be disciplined in their bodies, but there's just something about them and maybe even something about you that's just hard and you can't explain it. That's your soul. Our souls get hardened. There are souls that are hard. There are people who get hurt. There are people who get disappointed. There are people who have a lack of answers or ability to articulate the tragedies that they've experienced, and their soul gets hard. There's a protective shell that comes around them. There's a cynicism. There's a bitterness. There's an ability to talk about things, but if we start to go there, the walls go up. In Scripture, we see stories of brothers like Cain and Abel. We see a soil that's hard and a soil that's soft. We see Jacob and Esau, a soil that's hard and a soil that's soft. We see these examples. The world constantly tries to divert our souls, my soul and your soul, to make us think that we're more victims than we are human. And that hardens us. People are just forcing against us, doing these things. And we get so wrapped up in our hurt and so wrapped up in our pain or so wrapped up in our unmet expectations that we don't even recognize the hurt that we inflict. We don't recognize the walls that go up around our souls. Underneath the hardness, as the seed bounces off the ground, what's beneath the surface? There's fear, right? There's insecurity. There's the idea that we might lose control. There's the idea that we might look foolish. There's the idea that somebody might hurt us again. So we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to look dumb. We don't want to be insecure. And so we just put the shell up. And we think if I just stay hard, then I can just keep moving forward. I can just keep plowing forward. I can jump through the hoops, go through the motions, and then we just continue on. But in the dark moments of the night, we have this sense that something is just wrong. Our souls are broken because we're hard. The soil is hard. And yet there's this tiny seed that, given a crack in a sidewalk, can bring a tree up that dismantles all of the concrete around it if we just soften and allow that seed to penetrate. There's the hard soil. Then he says there's the shallow soil or the shallow soul, right? He describes this rocky ground, and what he's describing is not just that there were a bunch of rocks. This wasn't like some sort of hydroponic grow operation, right? He's saying that there was this soil, and when the seed fell into the soil, there was a layer of dirt that was on the surface. But when you dug the shovel down a little deeper, you just found giant rocks, right? You just found stones. There was a sense of something good at the surface. There was a little bit there, you looked and thought, okay, this seed has a place and there can be, but the ground was shallow, and so there were no roots that dug deep. And Jesus says that particular seed, that when it was planted in this shallow soul, that when the sun came, when the pressures came, it withered up and died. The rocky ground is the soul that really has no depth to it. Yeah, there's something there, but it's just really not very deep, right? The world conspires against our souls. Richard Foster, one of my favorite authors, said, superficiality is the curse of our age. We're just superficial. We're just on the surface. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to say the right things and have the right terminology and let the seed, let's just get it underneath the surface. We're going to let it get there. But we're superficial. The desperate need for the soul is not more intelligence. The desperate need for the soul is not more talent. The desperate need for our souls is not more excitement. We don't need louder music. Some of you amen to that. Maybe not. Maybe a little loud music would be good. But you know what I'm saying? Like the soul doesn't need more smarts. It doesn't need more education. It doesn't need what the soul needs is depth. The psalmist talks about, as the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for you. The psalmist also describes the soul being something that has the depths of the waterfalls, that there is this depth to the soul. What our soul needs is to acknowledge the depths, to recognize it. I remember when I was a kid, there was this lake that my family went to fishing on a couple of occasions in Utah. And whether this is true or not, I don't know. I didn't fact check this, but I was told as a child that no one had ever measured the depths of this particular lake in central Utah. And I remember when you were in a boat and you were going out on this boat, you could see the bottom. It was crystal clear. You could see the bottom. And as you came to this one spot, there literally was a drop off, like a black hole that was bottomless and endless. And I remember being a child and feeling comfortable in the boat until suddenly we crossed that. And there was this awareness, just this vastness, like this is deep. And that is our soul. Our soul is deep. And what our souls need is the recognition of its depth. We get that at times, right? Like a baby is born and there's this life-altering moment and suddenly we step out and we realize, oh man, like life is way different than I thought. Like all the stuff on the surface doesn't matter. Or we lose somebody, right? And there's perspective. And suddenly when somebody's gone from our life and we look at our own life and we look and we go, man, I mean, don't you do this? Like, don't you, when you're standing and you're mourning the loss of someone you love, don't you look at the vast majority of your life and go, it's so superficial. Why do we do those things? Because in those moments we're getting a window into our soul and we're acknowledging there is a depth to who we are. And the only way that our soul becomes the soul that God intended, the only way our soul makes us the integrated whole person God made us to be, is when we acknowledge the depths and we become deep people. A deep soul is conscious of eternity and doesn't live in spite of it. A deep soul is a soul that is acknowledging the reality of a creator and living in a way that is in rhythm with that creator. A deep soul is a soul that understands the gospel, that understands the brokenness of humanity and the implications of it, the love of God and what He's done for us, and the life that's lived in grace. That's the depth of a soul, is saying, there is a story beyond the story of my life. That's what a deep soul is all about. And Jesus says some of the seed scatters and it lands on souls that are shallow, and then life comes along and just scorches it out. And finally, He describes the cluttered soil or the cluttered soul. He says some of these seeds fall among the thorns. There's an old saying that says this: if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy, because either way, your soul will shrivel. The busy soul gets attached to the wrong things. And we mistake clutter and busyness and stuff and a full calendar. We mistake those things for life. We get preoccupied with the external, the successes. We get preoccupied with the opinions. We get preoccupied with the activity and the entertainment. We can do all of those things. We can look good on the outside. We can get distracted with the way that we dress and the places that we live and the cars that we drive. We know we can do all of these things and still have a sense of being dead inside. Jesus says the seed gets planted, and this cluttered life that you and I live, this constant shopping, buying, filling the needs, entertaining, going, running, vacationing, all these things, we can do all of those things and they can just choke out the life of the soul, eradicate anything that feels like life. Jesus says there are some where the seed, this good sower, spreads it, but their lives are so cluttered that it just chokes out the life. And we find ourselves going, this doesn't feel like life at all. But I believe the right things and I want to do the right things. I'm trying. See, we live in a soul-fragmenting, soul-challenging world. Leonard Cohen said this: the blizzard of the world has crossed the threshold, and it has overturned the order of the soul. Jesus' final description in this story is the good soil, or the good soul. When he says the good soul, it's not saying the good soil is like versus the bad soil, like you're bad, you're good. He's saying, no, there's soil that's good, and this is what the good soil looks like. What's the definition of the good soil? It's simply the opposite of the other three. You realize that? You want to understand where this journey of the soul begins? How you become good soil that multiplies and is fruitful? How does that happen in our lives? It happens when we acknowledge and recognize the dangers of the other three soils. Is your soul soft? Or is it hard? Like how's your softness? When people bring up things about spirituality or things about God, when there's conversations about what life's all about, do you get rigid? Do you get stiff? Do you get cynical? Do you say, I'll believe it when I see it? The good soil says, I'm going to open up a crack, I'm going to be soft, and I'm going to allow God to start redeeming and restoring my life. Is there a depth? Is there an understanding that there's more? Is there a part of you that says, I don't want to stay on the surface. I don't want to just live in superficiality. I don't want to just wake up to the glimpses that there's a depth and then ignore them the rest of the time. Is there a part of you that acknowledges and recognizes the depths of your soul? Are you a deep person? Do you allow yourself to go to those depths? We can love Jesus and still be shallow. Is it uncluttered? Does your pace, do your passions, do the things that you obsess about, do they reflect a life that's uncluttered? Or is it a life of hurry and panic and grasping and scarcity? What is it? All of these really are simply asking, how's your soul? How's your soul? And if the answer is not good, Jesus says, I want it to be good. I want you to be whole. Let's pray together. Jesus, this morning I pray this morning for your message of love and grace and wholeness, the seed of the gospel, to sink into our hearts. I pray that our hearts, our souls would be open, not hard. I pray that there would be a depth to them, that we'd be unafraid to plumb the depths of who you've made us to be. I pray that we'd allow that seed to come into a life that's ready to cast off all of the encumbrances and distractions and the hurry and the madness. Lord, I pray this morning you'd allow us to begin to see that the way that we live with our bodies is affecting our soul. The way that we think with our minds is shaping who we are, our soul. That the way that we say yes and no has an impact on our soul, our well-being, our wholeness. I pray that you'd begin this eye-opening experience of revealing to us the ways in which our lives can be integrated and become what you've desired them to become. I pray for wholeness. I pray for soulness, that we would be souls that are healthy and whole. I pray this in your name, Jesus.